So this is Second Peter chapter 3, the final chapter of Second Peter, and the scripture for the 22nd of July. So in the early church, some of you may know, the prevailing opinion was that Jesus was going to come back probably next weekend. Or if not next weekend, then maybe in a couple of months. Or, maybe if he delays a little bit, maybe next year. The thought was that Jesus was coming back very soon. And so whenever we see stuff, particularly in Paul's letters, like in Thessalonians, or otherwise, that says Jesus will be coming like a thief in the night, oftentimes what was thought is that, well, he's coming tomorrow, so be ready. So after having waited decades, the early church, some in the early church anyway, wondered if Jesus would, actually return. This is a particularly distressing development. After all, if there's not going to be any triumphant return of justice, then what good is discipleship? If we can't count on God to come back and restore all things and make all things new, then why are we beating our heads against the wall here? What are we doing? If the world's going to go on, perhaps the legacy we ought to leave isn't a spiritual legacy, but a legacy for our biological children. Maybe we need to make sure that we leave enough finances for them to get ahead further than we did. Or maybe, we need to leave something behind, some sort of memorial for ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to be forgotten if the world keeps going. But then there's a slippery slope, I think, in this thought process to avoiding necessary life changes. Since if our own legacy and our own descendants are prioritized over and against God, we might refuse to stop pursuing money or pursuing fame because there are other more important things like God's glory to pursue, if in fact we think that our own legacy is the most important. We might refuse to stop sinning and instead say, well, if there is some sort of God who's going to come make all things right, that God will forgive me. That's not the right way to approach life. And this is what Peter saw some people doing in the early church. Peter reminds us that God created the world. God destroyed the world once before and came as a surprise to everybody involved. God's plans, however, are often more audacious than we expect. There's this beautiful image in this chapter of how God relates to time, that one day can be as 1,000 years to God, and 1,000 years can be as a day. Being unrestricted by time allows God to go about things the right way, instead of doing things the urgent way or the right now way. He doesn't have to worry about the immediate taking precedence over the important, in other words. God is working to redeem as many human beings as possible, and that's going to take some time. But the upshot of this is that more and more people will learn about Jesus Christ and Him crucified and risen again. So therefore, we are called to live as those who are prepared to die, so that in dying we might go forth to live. These words are part of a memorial service liturgy that I'm rather fond of. I use in many of my memorial services that I oversee. And they speak both to the promise of God in death, along with the cost of sin in death. You see, sin requires these bodies and this earth we live on to be set aside at the end of all things, allowing a new heaven and a new earth with new people created in God's image and free from sin to be created, for these new bodies to be given to us, the new heaven and earth for us to reside in. This is a promise we cannot ignore, that the end of all things is nearer today than it was yesterday, and just because it's taking some time to get there doesn't mean it will never come. Now, Peter does end on an encouraging note, and that's that he found Paul's letters confusing and hard to understand too. So if you're in that camp too, you're not alone. Peter, the rock that the church was founded upon, didn't get some of what Paul was saying. Now, I think in all seriousness, Peter knows that because we're dealing with a complex interplay between God and human beings, all of these writings can be trusted, but all of these writings can also be twisted. We are called to live within the grace and knowledge of God and allow that to guide our steps and to keep us from twisting these scriptures. So I wonder, in light of Peter's instructions, how can you conduct your life in the right way instead of the right now way? That's all for 2 Peter 3, and that concludes our study of 2 Peter. Tomorrow, the 23rd of July, we'll be looking at Jude. Jude has only one chapter. After that, we'll be going on to the Gospel of Matthew. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.